Nineveh was once the largest city on earth, a walled capital stretched across the eastern bank of the Tigris River, with walls running nearly 8 miles around its perimeter, and a population that may have reached 150,000 people at its peak. Most people know its name from the Book of Jonah, where God sends a reluctant prophet to warn a city teetering on the edge of divine judgment. What almost nobody asks is what that city actually looked like from the inside, and what it felt like to live within those walls on an ordinary morning in the 7th century before Christ. That question is harder to answer than it sounds, because for nearly 2,500 years, Nineveh was simply gone, not abandoned, not ruined, gone, buried under accumulating centuries of silt, collapsed mud brick, and desert dust, until the very name of the place had faded from human memory. When the Greek soldier and writer Xenophon marched past the mounds that covered it in 401 BC, less than 2 centuries after the city's destruction, he had no idea what lay beneath his feet. The greatest city of the ancient Near East had become a hill. It would remain a hill for another 2,000 years. Then, in 1845, an English archaeologist named Austen Henry Layard began digging into one of those mounds near the modern Iraqi city of Mosul, and the world Nineveh had kept locked underground for millennia began to surface again, carved panel by panel, tablet by tablet, room by room. What Layard found was not what anyone expected. To understand Nineveh, you have to begin with geography, because Nineveh's location was not an accident. The city sat at a natural crossroads in northern Mesopotamia, positioned at the confluence of the Tigris River and a smaller tributary called the Kossa. To its east and northeast, the foothills of the Zagros Mountains rose against the horizon, sources of timber, stone, and the mountain peoples who alternately traded with and threatened the lowland cities. To its south and southwest, the great agricultural plains of Mesopotamia stretched outward, fed by river water and capable of producing enormous quantities of barley, the staple crop of the ancient Near East. To its west, caravan routes reached toward the Levantine coast, and beyond it, the Mediterranean world. Nineveh sat where all of these systems intersected, and for thousands of years before the Assyrian period, people had recognized the strategic value of that position. The site had been inhabited for more than 6,000 years before the Neo-Assyrian kings made it their capital. By the time Sennacherib chose it as the seat of empire in 705 BC, Nineveh already carried layers of history thick enough to constitute an archaeology of their own. Ancient temples dedicated to gods whose names predated the Assyrian pantheon stood within the city. Residential neighborhoods had been built, abandoned, collapsed, and built over again so many times that the accumulated debris formed elevated mounds, called tells, that raised the city's profile above the surrounding plain. When the Assyrians looked at Nineveh, they were looking at a place that had been sacred, inhabited, and significant since before the earliest written records. But what the Assyrian kings did to Nineveh was something different in scale from anything the city had experienced before. The empire that Nineveh commanded at its peak in the 7th century BC was the largest territorial state the ancient world had yet produced. It stretched from the Persian Gulf in the east to Egypt in the west, from the mountains of what is today Iran and Turkey in the north, to the edge of the Arabian Peninsula in the south. The provinces and vassal kingdoms within this territory included Babylon, one of the most culturally prestigious cities in the ancient world, the ports of the Phoenician coast, the kingdoms of the Levant, and, briefly, the entire Nile Valley. Tribute from all of these territories flowed into Nineveh in the form of silver, gold, grain, timber, horses, livestock, textile goods, and human laborers. The city was the drain into which the wealth of the ancient Near East poured. This is the context you need to hold in mind as you try to picture the physical reality of Nineveh. Its scale was not simply the expression of one king's ambition, it was the material consequence of an empire that had no peer. King Sennacherib, who rebuilt and expanded Nineveh beginning around 700 BC, left detailed inscriptions describing what he had done to the city. He was not modest. He called his palace the palace without rival, a name that was not entirely self-promotional, because the evidence suggests it may have been the largest single residential building constructed anywhere in the ancient world up to that point. He described the canals he dug, the gardens he planted, the streets he widened, the temples he restored, and the walls he raised to heights that he claimed made the city effectively impregnable. For once, the royal bragging aligns reasonably well with what the archaeology has confirmed. Here is what Nineveh's walls actually looked like. Sennacherib's construction project enclosed approximately 1,800 acres within a ring of massive mud brick and stone structures. The walls ran for roughly 7.5 miles in circumference and were reinforced at regular intervals by towers that rose above the wall line, giving defenders broad visibility and firing angles over the surrounding terrain. The total height of the walls with their towers likely reached 25 to 30 feet or more. 15 gates opened through the walls at strategic points, each named for a deity or natural phenomenon. The gate of the god Adad, the gate of the moon god, the Mashki gate, which faced the river. Each gate was a complex of passageways, guard rooms, and massive wooden doors reinforced with metal fittings. But here is the detail that most people miss entirely. Flanking every major gate were lamasu. These were enormous composite sculptures, typically carved from single blocks of limestone, weighing between 20 and 30 tons, depicting figures with the body of a bull or lion, the wings of an eagle, and a human face wearing the horned crown of divinity. They were not decorative in any casual sense. They were understood to be divine guardians, whose spiritual power protected the city, and whose physical presence communicated, to anyone approaching the gate from outside, exactly what kind of force they were dealing with. A merchant arriving at Nineveh from the Levant, stepping off a weeks-long caravan route and approaching the gate for the first time, would have walked between two of these creatures, each taller than a two-story building, with eyes carved to convey not welcome, but warning. Now watch what happens when you step inside. The palace complex dominated the southern quarter of the city. Sennacherib's southwest palace, whose ruins Layard first began to excavate in 1847, covered more than 20 acres of ground. It contained more than 70 rooms, many of them lined with carved limestone reliefs, from floor to nearly ceiling height, running continuously around the walls in narrative sequences that depicted royal hunting parties, military campaigns, and religious ceremonies. The throne room, where the king received ambassadors, provincial governors, and foreign delegations, measured roughly 180 feet in length and 40 feet in width. The ceilings were cedar beams imported from Lebanon. The floors were polished stone. The doors were framed in bronze fittings engraved with royal imagery. To walk through the throne room of Sennacherib's palace was to be surrounded on all sides by an argument, carved in permanent stone, about the nature and legitimacy of Assyrian power. The carvings did not simply decorate, they made a claim. They said, "Look at what this king has conquered. Look at the gods who support him. Look at the scale of what this empire has built. You are standing inside the proof." The water systems of Nineveh deserve a separate moment of attention because they were extraordinary in ways that most documentary treatments of the ancient world pass over too quickly. Sennacherib's inscriptions describe a canal project that brought water from the mountains of Kenes, roughly 50 miles to the north, down to Nineveh through a system of stone-lined channels that crossed valleys, traversed ridges, and distributed water across the city's agricultural hinterland. One section of this system, discovered near the modern village of Jerwan, included a proto-aqueduct, a stone bridge carrying the canal channel over a valley on arched stonework, spanning approximately 900 feet in length. The Jerwan aqueduct was built using stone arches, making it one of the earliest examples of true arch construction in architectural history, predating similar Roman achievements by several centuries. For the inhabitants of Nineveh, this canal system meant something concrete and immediate: gardens. Sennacherib described planting what he called a wonder for all peoples, an elaborate garden planted with trees, vines, and exotic plants from across the empire. Some scholars have suggested that this garden, fed by the mountain canal water, may have been the historical basis for the Hanging Gardens, later associated in classical sources with Babylon. Whether or not that identification holds, the physical reality of a large irrigated garden in the capital city was real and remarkable, a landscape of controlled abundance in a region where water was the most precious resource imaginable. But the canal water did not reach every household equally. This is where the daily life of Nineveh becomes more complicated than the palace inscriptions suggest, and more recognizable to a modern eye. If you were an ordinary person living in Nineveh in 680 BC, you lived in one of the residential districts that occupied most of the city's 1,800 enclosed acres. Your home was built from mud brick, the same material used in Mesopotamian construction for thousands of years before your time, because mud brick was durable, thermally efficient, and available in vast quantities. A typical residential home in Nineveh was arranged around a central courtyard, an open-air space that served simultaneously as your kitchen, your workshop, your social space, and on certain occasions, your sleeping area. The courtyard was where the day actually happened. In the early morning, the courtyard fire would have been lit to heat water and begin the process of bread preparation. Barley was the foundational grain of the Mesopotamian diet, and turning barley grain into the flatbread that formed the caloric backbone of the daily diet required grinding. That grinding was done by hand, using a rotary saddle quern or, in later periods, a rotary hand mill, pushing the grain back and forth or rotating it against a lower stone to produce the coarse flour used in baking. This process, repeated every single morning to produce enough flour for the household's daily needs, could easily consume 2 to 3 hours of continuous physical effort. It was the sonic rhythm of the city at dawn, the grinding of grain in 1,000 courtyards simultaneously. Bread was baked in clay ovens built into the courtyard. The loaves were small and dense, often mixed with sesame seeds or flavored with cumin. Alongside the bread, the household would have prepared lentil or chickpea stew, seasoned with onions, garlic, and leeks, supplemented with whatever oil and dried herbs were available. Sesame oil was the primary cooking fat of the Ninevite kitchen, used both for cooking and for fueling the small clay lamps that provided light in the evenings. Dried fish, hauled upriver from the Persian Gulf and the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, provided the main protein source for households that could not afford regular meat. Meat was not a daily food for ordinary people. Sheep and goats were valuable economic assets kept primarily for wool and milk, slaughtered only at festivals, for significant household events, or when the animal had aged beyond its productive usefulness. The experience of eating roasted meat in ancient Nineveh was, for most people, tied to a festival day, a wedding, or a ritual occasion. It was food that arrived with meaning attached. The question of water deserves to be slowed down, because the physical labor of water collection is something modern readers almost always underestimate. Despite Sennacherib's canal engineering, the majority of Nineveh's population did not have water delivered to their homes. Water was collected from neighborhood cisterns, from the Hossa tributary that ran through the city, or from the canal channels distributed through the city's agricultural zones, and it was transported home by hand, in large clay jars that could hold anywhere from 10 to 20 liters when full. The weight of a full 20-liter jar approaches 50 pounds. A household of 5 or 6 people might require 50 to 80 liters of water per day for cooking, drinking, washing grain, and basic cleaning. That is 3 to 8 trips with a full jar, each trip involving filling, lifting, carrying, and unloading. This task fell primarily to women and to household servants or slaves. In practical terms, it meant that a significant portion of every morning was already committed to water before a single other task could begin. Fresh vegetables supplemented the diet for households that maintained garden plots in the city's open spaces or the agricultural zone just outside the walls. Cucumbers, various gourds, onions, garlic, leeks, cress, and root vegetables appear in Mesopotamian texts from the period. Fruit was available seasonally, dates were a dietary staple in southern Mesopotamia, but less common in the north, while pomegranates, figs, and grapes provided sweetness, and in the case of grapes, the basis for wine production. Honey was the primary sweetener available to ordinary households. The surrounding agricultural hinterland of Nineveh was intensively managed. Irrigation canals extended for miles in every direction beyond the city walls, dividing the landscape into cultivated fields and orchard plots. Barley, emmer wheat, and flax were the primary crops. The flax was processed into linen, the barley into grain, beer, and animal feed. The agricultural system feeding Nineveh was sophisticated enough to support 150,000 people at sustained population levels, which means it was producing enormous quantities of food on a consistent basis, year after year, with the additional challenge of provisioning not just a civilian population, but also a military apparatus of significant scale. Now move from the household to the gate, because that is where the city's commercial life concentrated. The markets of Nineveh operated in the spaces near the great city gates, where the flow of incoming and outgoing goods naturally concentrated. These were not quiet, orderly places. They were dense, noisy, multilingual environments where merchants from across the known world competed for space, customers, and advantageous deals. To understand the commercial diversity of Nineveh's markets, you have to remember what the city was drawing toward itself. As the capital of an empire that stretched from Egypt to Iran, Nineveh was the ultimate destination for tribute flowing in from every province, and the origin point for administrative orders, military supplies, and economic flows going back out. This created an environment in which goods from dozens of different cultural zones circulated through the same market spaces. Aramaic-speaking merchants from the Levantine cities brought textiles, cedar timber, and glass. Caravans from the east carried lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, tin from the Iranian plateau, and horses from the breeding grounds of the Zagros foothills, horses that the Assyrian military machine consumed in enormous numbers and was never quite able to produce domestically at sufficient scale. Egyptian and Phoenician goods arrived through the western provinces: fine linen, purple-dyed cloth, carved ivory, and luxury ceramic ware. Commodity goods from Babylonia in the south, including agricultural products, bitumen for construction waterproofing, and high-quality craft items, moved through the market regularly. But here is the detail almost nobody mentions. The commercial economy of Nineveh operated not primarily through barter, but through a sophisticated credit and contract system recorded on clay tablets. Silver, measured in shekel weight units, functioned as the standard medium of exchange for significant transactions. But even beyond silver exchange, the merchant community of Nineveh was using financial instruments that would not reappear in most parts of the world for another 2 millennia. Forward contracts. A merchant in Nineveh could purchase the right to receive a specified quantity of grain, wool, or metal at a specified future date, at a price agreed upon today. This is a futures contract in its essential function, and it was operating in the markets of 7th century BC Nineveh. Loan contracts specified principal amounts, interest rates typically measured at a standard monthly or annual rate, repayment schedules, and consequences for default. Partnership agreements allowed 2 or more merchants to pool resources for a trading venture, share risk, and divide profit according to their agreed proportionate contribution. All of these transactions required scribes, because cuneiform tablets were the legal documents of the ancient Near East, and a transaction not recorded on clay had no legal standing. Scribal training was a professional investment of years, and a skilled commercial scribe could command significant fees for recording the contracts, property transfers, loan agreements, and legal declarations that the commercial life of the city required. In the marketplaces of Nineveh, the sound of a stylus pressing into wet clay was as constant as the sound of merchants haggling. The workshops that produced the goods traded in those markets occupied specialized districts of the city. Bronzesmiths worked in areas where the temperature and smoke of their smelting fires would not create hazards for residential neighborhoods. The bronze work of Nineveh ranged from the strictly utilitarian, weapons, tools, fittings, agricultural implements, to the highly refined, ritual vessels, architectural decorations, and ornamental objects commissioned by the palace and temple authorities. Iron was beginning to supplement bronze during this period, but the full transition to iron-dominant tool production had not yet occurred, meaning bronze smiths were still the critical metalworkers of the city. Potters occupied another specialized zone. Pottery in Nineveh was not a craft producing objects of individual artistic expression. It was a production industry generating the clay vessels used across every dimension of daily life. Storage jars for grain and oil, cooking pots, serving bowls, water jars, lamps, figurines, cuneiform tablets, architectural elements including drainage pipes and brick forms, ritual vessels used in temple ceremonies. The output of Nineveh's pottery industry was measured not in individual pieces, but in thousands of units per year. Textile production centered on wool. Sheep raising was the economic backbone of Assyrian agriculture in the upland provinces, and the wool those flocks produced flowed into the city as raw material and left it as finished textiles, representing one of the empire's most valuable export commodities. The processing of wool into thread and thread into cloth required multiple stages of labor: shearing, cleaning, carding, spinning, weaving, finishing, and each stage could be performed by different specialized workers. Women performed much of the spinning and weaving, sometimes in household contexts and sometimes in organized workshop settings under the direction of palace or temple administrators. Stone carving was perhaps the most prestigious craft in Nineveh. The sculptors who carved the palace reliefs were producing work of extraordinary technical refinement under conditions of royal supervision, working in sequences that depicted military campaigns, royal hunting scenes, and divine rituals in a narrative visual language that could be read by a viewer walking through the palace's corridors. The scale of this work was enormous. The Southwest Palace alone contained roughly 2 miles of relief carvings on its walls, all carved in limestone panels measuring roughly 5 feet in height. Each panel required quarrying the stone from sites to the north of the city, transporting it to the palace on sledges and riverboats, setting it in place, and then carving it with precision instruments to the final design. The reliefs themselves record the logistics of this work in one of history's most striking instances of self-documentation. Several panels in the palace depict, in carved stone, the process of transporting the massive lamasu sculptures from their quarry to the palace gate. The images show teams of laborers, dozens of men to a single sculpture, pulling the stone figure on a wooden sledge, while supervisors with counting rods direct the effort and overseers on the sledge itself maintain the stability of the load. Beside the laboring teams, a foreman stands with a scroll, and in the background, other workers carry water jars to keep the laborers hydrated. This is where the documentation becomes significant in a way that goes beyond logistics. The labor force pulling those sledges was not primarily composed of free Assyrian citizens doing compensated work. A substantial portion of the workforce that built Nineveh's monuments was made up of deportees from conquered territories, people who had been forcibly relocated hundreds of miles from their homelands and pressed into the labor requirements of the imperial capital. The inscriptions that describe Sennacherib's building projects mention craftsmen brought from multiple conquered nations: Babylonians, Aramaeans, people from the Levantine coast. And in the 701 BC campaign against Judah alone, Sennacherib's own annals claim the deportation of more than 200,000 people. But that is a chapter of Nineveh's story that deserves to be addressed in its proper place. First, the city's religious life. Religion in Nineveh was not a private matter confined to designated sacred spaces. It was the architecture through which the entire society understood itself, organized its time, justified its power, and navigated its relationship to forces larger than human control. The city contained at least 30 temples. The oldest and most prestigious was the Temple of Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, whose sanctuary at Nineveh was already ancient when the Assyrian Empire was still forming. Cuneiform records indicate that the Ishtar temple at Nineveh had been a site of significant religious activity since at least the 2nd millennium BC, meaning that by the 7th century, when the city was at its imperial peak, the temple had been receiving worshippers for more than 1,000 years. Egyptian records from the New Kingdom period, roughly 1550 to 1070 BC, mention the Ishtar of Nineveh as a goddess of such prestige that Egyptian pharaohs requested statues of her to be sent south for healing and religious purposes. The festivals organized around the major temples structured the city's calendar in the most literal sense. The New Year festival, called Akitu, was the most important ritual event of the year, involving elaborate multi-day ceremonies that included the ritual humiliation of the king, who was symbolically stripped of his royal regalia before the god Marduk, and then reinvested with authority, demonstrating that royal power derived from divine grant rather than human assertion. Processions moved through the city's main streets, carrying divine statues on ritual boats and platforms, with the entire population expected to participate. Sacrifices were performed publicly. Communal meals followed. For several days, the city's ordinary commercial and administrative rhythms were suspended in favor of collective religious observance. The priesthood that administered these ceremonies was not simply a spiritual organization, it was an economic and administrative institution of considerable power. Temple estates in Nineveh controlled agricultural land both within the city's territory and in the surrounding region. This land produced grain, oil, and fiber crops that were stored in temple granaries and could be redistributed to dependent populations during shortage, lent out at interest to merchants and farmers, or used to support the priests and temple personnel who performed the continuous cycle of daily rituals. Temples also functioned as lending institutions, providing silver and grain loans to individuals and commercial enterprises at established interest rates. The records of these transactions were kept on clay tablets and stored in temple archives that constituted, in effect, a financial record-keeping system serving the broader population. Divination was the technology through which divine will was made legible to human beings, and it operated at every level of Ninevite society. At the highest level, royal diviners examined the livers and other entrails of sacrificed animals before any significant royal decision, including military campaigns, the appointment of officials, and major construction projects. The examination of a sheep's liver was not a simple or quick procedure. The liver was inspected for dozens of specific characteristics: the shape of particular lobes, the presence of markings, deformations, or color variations in specified zones, each of which carried an established interpretive meaning according to texts that had been accumulating for centuries. The diviner's job was to read the liver against this accumulated interpretive tradition and render a verdict on whether the proposed action was divinely favored, divinely opposed, or uncertain. Similar consultations occurred at the household level, though with less elaborate procedure. Personal divination could involve examining the behavior of oil poured on water, observing the flight patterns of birds, interpreting unusual occurrences in daily life, or consulting a professional diviner who specialized in reading dreams or other omens. A merchant about to commit to a major trading venture, a farmer about to make a significant investment in seed grain, a family about to negotiate a marriage arrangement. All of these situations could prompt a consultation of divine signs before action was taken. Embedded in the physical structure of every household was a parallel layer of personal religious practice that operated independently of the temple system. Small clay figurines, typically representing protective deities or stylized female forms associated with fertility and household protection, have been found in excavations of Ninevite residential areas, placed in doorways, beneath thresholds, and under the floors of rooms, positioned to create a network of supernatural protection around the domestic space. Larger household shrines held images of family ancestor spirits, who were believed to maintain an active relationship with their living descendants and required periodic offerings of food, water, and attention to remain benevolent. The boundary between the living and the dead in Ninevite religious understanding was permeable, managed rather than sealed, and the household was the primary site where that management occurred. Understanding this layer of personal religious life is important for reading the biblical texts about Nineveh, because when the author of Jonah describes the Ninevites as capable of sincere religious response, he is not describing a population with no prior relationship to the concept of divine accountability. He is describing a population whose daily domestic life was structured around constant, if conventional, religious practice. Now move from the temples to the administrative machinery that held the city together. Governing 150,000 people in a pre-industrial urban environment required a degree of administrative sophistication that the modern imagination often fails to attribute to ancient societies. The evidence from Nineveh suggests that the Assyrian administrative system was, by any reasonable standard, highly capable. The king stood at the theoretical apex of all authority. Every law, every appointment, every military campaign, every large-scale construction project flowed from royal mandate. But the practical administration of the empire was conducted through a layered bureaucracy of appointed officials whose responsibilities were clearly defined, documented in writing, and subject to audit. Provincial governors, called rabbiti or saknu depending on their level, administered the empire's territorial divisions. Each governor collected taxes in specified forms from the population under his authority, organized labor for state projects within his province, maintained public order, and reported regularly to the capital through a relay messenger system that connected Nineveh to the empire's outermost provinces. The messenger relay system is worth slowing down on, because it represents a level of information management that often surprises people who assume ancient states were largely isolated from their provinces. Relay stations were positioned along the major roads at intervals of roughly a day's travel. A sealed clay tablet letter could move from a province hundreds of miles away to the capital in a matter of days through this relay system, with each messenger carrying the tablet to the next station and handing it off to a fresh messenger for the next leg of the journey. The cuneiform archives recovered from Nineveh include hundreds of letters from provincial officials, military commanders, and local administrators reporting on local conditions, requesting instructions, and responding to royal inquiries. The volume and detail of this correspondence shows a government actively managing an enormous territory in real time. Legal disputes in the city were adjudicated by reference to established precedent and, in significant cases, by royal decree. The Assyrian legal tradition drew on Mesopotamian law codes that had been evolving for more than 1,000 years before the Assyrian period, including traditions that had been codified in documents like the Code of Hammurabi. Property disputes, inheritance questions, debt collection cases, and contract violations were among the most common legal matters brought before officials. Scribes recorded the proceedings and judgments on clay tablets that were stored in administrative archives. The tax burden on ordinary Ninevites was considerable. Taxes were assessed in grain, silver, and labor, and the records suggest that collection was rigorous. In addition to regular taxes, extraordinary labor demands could be levied for specific royal projects. When Sennacherib was rebuilding the palace, for example, corvée labor was imposed on the population to provide workers for the construction effort. This labor obligation fell most heavily on those who had no cash or grain reserves to pay a substitution fee and had to contribute their bodies directly to the work. Now step back from the administrative system and look at the people who lived within it. The social landscape of Nineveh was more diverse than the word Assyrian city might initially suggest. At the top of the social hierarchy sat the royal family, senior military commanders, high priestly officials, and the major provincial governors who administered the empire. Beneath them, a middle layer of skilled craftsmen, merchants, lower-ranking priests, scribes, and minor officials lived in relative economic stability. Below them, the majority of the population worked in agriculture, construction, domestic service, and unskilled labor. but the picture is complicated by the empire's deportation policy. For roughly 3 centuries before the city's fall, in 612 BC, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had been systematically relocating conquered populations from their homelands and resettling them within Assyria. The stated rationale was both economic and political. Economically, the empire needed skilled labor in the capital region. Politically, uprooting a population from its homeland and dispersing it among strangers reduced its capacity for organized resistance to Assyrian authority. The policy was applied consistently and at enormous scale. The result, in Nineveh's streets, was a multilingual, multi-ethnic urban environment without close parallel anywhere in the ancient world. Aramaic-speaking deportees from the Levant, speakers of Babylonian Akkadian from the south, Elamite-speaking communities from the east, people of Israelite origin from the northern kingdom whose 10 tribes had been scattered by the Assyrian campaigns of the 8th century BC, people from the kingdoms of the Taurus Mountains, from the Arab tribes of the desert margins, from the Nile Delta, from the cities of the Anatolian Plateau. The evidence for this diversity is visible in the cuneiform archives. Administrative documents from Nineveh record names following phonological and morphological patterns from multiple different linguistic traditions. A list of workers assigned to a royal project might include Assyrian names, Aramaic names, Babylonian names, and names showing Hebrew or other Levantine patterns, all in the same document. These were not foreign visitors passing through the city. They were residents with fixed assignments within the labor and administrative system. And here is the part that flips the whole scene. These deportee communities were not simply dissolved into Assyrian culture. The evidence suggests that they maintained distinct identities, religious practices, and community structures, at least in the first and second generations after deportation. An Israelite family resettled in Nineveh in 720 BC did not instantly stop being Israelite. They maintained their language among themselves, preserved their stories and religious practices in household contexts, and likely lived near other members of their community in designated residential areas. The diversity of Nineveh was real, but it was not harmonious multiculturalism. It was the enforced cohabitation of peoples who had been brought to the same city under circumstances of profound violence. That violence is the part of Nineveh's story that cannot be left in the background. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was not a state that happened to use violence as one tool among many. It was a state that understood terror as a primary instrument of governance, deployed it deliberately, and documented it with pride. The carved reliefs on the walls of Sennacherib's palace are not merely artistic decoration. They are a systematic political argument carved in stone and displayed in the seat of imperial power, and they describe, in visual detail, what happened to people who resisted Assyrian authority. The imagery is explicit. Conquered kings are shown standing before Sennacherib in postures of complete submission. Enemy soldiers are depicted falling beneath Assyrian assault, and in the most confrontational panels, prisoners of war are shown subjected to punishments designed not merely to kill, but to communicate, to the survivors, to future enemies, to the gods themselves, that the cost of resistance was not simply defeat, but humiliation, pain, and eradication. The textual record is even more direct. Sennacherib's annals describe the destruction of Babylon after a revolt. I leveled the city and its houses from the foundations to the top. I devastated and burned them. I razed the wall and outer wall, temples and gods, temple towers of brick and earth, as many as there were, and threw them into the Aratu Canal. This is not a description of collateral damage. It is a description of calculated total destruction as deliberate policy. The annals from the 701 BC campaign into Judah state that Sennacherib captured 46 walled cities and countless villages, deported 200,150 people, and shut Hezekiah, the king of Judah, up in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. Jerusalem itself was not destroyed in that campaign, for reasons that remain debated by historians and theologians alike. But the destruction that occurred throughout the Judean countryside in 701 BC was comprehensive, and the 200,000 people deported from Judah at that time arrived in Nineveh and its surroundings as bound laborers. Some of those laborers built the Southwest Palace. There is a particular weight to this fact when you sit with it. The carved reliefs depicting Sennacherib's triumph over Judah, reliefs that show Judean prisoners being marched into exile with their belongings on their backs, were carved by craftsmen who may themselves have been among those prisoners, or their children. The stone panels celebrating Assyrian power over the peoples of the ancient Near East were produced by the people Assyrian power had broken. The palace that proclaimed imperial dominance was built by the dominated. Within the city, the deportee populations lived under conditions that combined economic utility with legal vulnerability. They were required to perform the labor assignments given to them, could not leave their assigned territory without permission, and had limited access to the legal remedies available to Assyrian citizens. Debt slavery extended the constraint further. A person who fell into debt without the means to repay could be required to offer their own labor or the labor of family members as collateral. The threshold between debt slavery and outright slavery was not a sharp legal line. It was a gradual slope that could slide quickly downward under economic pressure. This is the city that the prophet Jonah was told to enter. And it fell. In 612 BC, a coalition of Babylonian and Median forces, led respectively by Nabopolassar of Babylon and Cyaxares of the Medes, converged on Nineveh after a period of Assyrian weakness following the death of the last capable Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, in 627 BC. The siege of the city lasted for several months. Then the defenses failed. The Babylonian Chronicle, a contemporary historical document written by Babylonian scribes, who had no reason to exaggerate the speed or completeness of the victory, records that the city was captured after the coalition forces besieged it. The text describes the city being taken and a great defeat inflicted on the people. The Assyrian royal family fled northward. The imperial capital, the palace without rival, the great library of 30,000 tablets, the Ishtar temple with its 1,000-year history, all of it fell into Babylonian and Median hands. Archaeological evidence from the destruction layer confirms the violence of the end. In some areas of the city, burned deposits several feet thick mark the locations where structures were set on fire. Collapsed wall sections show evidence of assault damage. Material culture found in the destruction layer, weapons, pottery, personal objects abandoned in flight or during assault, creates a picture of abrupt and violent termination rather than gradual decline. The Book of Nahum, written by a Hebrew prophet who addressed himself to the city of Nineveh in the decades before its fall, had described this moment with prophetic clarity that feels, given the archaeological record, less like prophecy and more like strategic analysis. The river gates are thrown open, and the palace collapses. It is decreed that the city be exiled and carried away. The shields of the soldiers are red, the warriors are clad in scarlet. Nineveh is like a pool, and its water is draining away. There are ancient Mesopotamian texts that suggest a significant flood event affected the Tigris River during the period of the siege, potentially weakening sections of the defensive walls. The river imagery in Nahum aligns precisely with what would have been a known vulnerability of a city that depended on river defenses and mud brick construction for its protection. After 612 BC, the ruins of Nineveh were not rebuilt. The Babylonians and Medes who captured it did not establish a successor capital on the same site. The city's specialized administrative and commercial functions were redistributed to Babylon, which became the dominant power in the region. Nineveh itself was looted and left. The structures that were not burned collapsed over decades as rain and freeze-thaw cycles eroded the mud brick into formless mounds. Weeds and scrub grew over the remains. The population dispersed. By the time Xenophon's Greek mercenary army passed through the region in 401 BC, the mounds were already unidentifiable to outsiders. He noted large uninhabited ruins near the Tigris, but recorded them under a name that reflected local memory of a much older neighboring settlement. Not Nineveh, the greatest city of the ancient Near East, had been erased from living memory in less than 2 centuries. When Austin Henry Layard's excavations in the 1840s and 1850s began exposing the buried palace rooms, the lamasu sculptures, and the clay tablets of the Royal Library, the scholars who gathered to examine the discoveries had to develop entirely new interpretive tools to understand what they were seeing. The cuneiform script on the tablets had to be deciphered from scratch. The iconography of the reliefs had to be systematically categorized. The languages embedded in the administrative archives had to be reconstructed from first principles. It was one of the most intensive archaeological and linguistic reconstruction projects in modern history, and it produced a library of evidence that continues to generate new insights about ancient life. Among the tablets recovered from Ashurbanipal's library were copies of texts that had been circulating in Mesopotamia for well over 1,000 years before Nineveh's fall. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest substantial literary narrative, was among them. So were astronomical records tracking the movements of the planets across centuries. Medical texts describing symptoms and treatments, omen collections, mathematical tables, hymns to the gods. The Library of Nineveh was not assembled for display, it was assembled for use, and the range of its contents suggests a court culture that genuinely valued accumulated knowledge across multiple domains. Now sit with what 3 biblical books say about this city, because the biblical engagement with Nineveh is not uniform, and the variations matter. The book of Nahum is written from inside the experience of Assyrian brutality. The prophet was addressing an Israelite audience that had lived under Assyrian domination for generations, had watched Assyrian armies destroy their northern kingdom, deport their kin, and lay siege to their capital. When Nahum writes, "Woe to the city of blood, full of plunder, never without victims," he is not composing a theological abstraction. He is naming what his people knew the city to be: the deportation records, the palace reliefs, the annals boasting of destruction. These are the historical reality behind Nahum's poetry. Reading Nahum without that historical context is like reading a witness testimony without knowing what crime was committed. The words mean less. The book of Zephaniah, written around the same period, describes Nineveh's coming desolation in terms that also carry their historical weight more clearly when set against the archaeological record. He will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria, and will make Nineveh a desolation, as dry as the desert. Flocks and herds will lie down there, creatures of every kind. The desert owl and the screech owl will roost on her columns. Archaeological surveys of the Nineveh site through the centuries following its destruction record exactly this progression. The structures gradually fill with wind-blown sediment. The area returns to scrub and pasture, and what was once the most powerful city on earth becomes, within a few centuries, a landscape indistinguishable from the surrounding plain. And then there is the Book of Jonah. The Book of Jonah is one of the most astonishing theological documents in the entire Hebrew Bible, and its astonishment is not always visible when Nineveh is treated as an abstraction. The book's central theological claim is that God's concern for human life is not bounded by ethnic, national, or even moral category, that the same God who sent Nahum's message of judgment also sent a prophet to give Nineveh an opportunity to change course, and that when the city responded with fasting and mourning, the judgment was suspended. Understanding what Nineveh actually was makes this claim harder, not easier. If you know only the name, the book's premise is a conventional theological point about divine mercy. If you know the 200,000 deportees from Judah, the impaled leaders, the cities reduced to ash by deliberate policy, the palace reliefs boasting of all of it in carved stone, then the suggestion that this city was capable of genuine repentance, and that this possibility mattered enough to God that he would send a reluctant prophet to offer it, becomes a claim of extraordinary moral and theological density. The book itself seems to be aware of the weight of what it is claiming. Jonah's refusal to go, his flight in the opposite direction, and his fury after the city is spared are not simply character flaws, they are recognizable human responses to being asked to extend grace towards something that has earned its condemnation. Jonah knows what Nineveh is. He has presumably lived in a world shaped by what it has done. The thought of its repentance is not relief to him, it is offense. And God's response to that offense is the theological center of the book. Should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left? That question was not addressed only to Jonah. It was addressed to every generation of readers who would encounter it after him, including readers who would one day be able to walk through Layard's excavation reports, examine the palace reliefs in the British Museum, and read the annals of Sennacherib, boasting of his campaigns against the very ancestors of those readers. The question does not soften what Nineveh was. It does not erase the record. It simply insists that the record is not the whole story. To walk through Nineveh's gates, even in imagination, and to see the markets and the courtyard fires and the grinding querns and the lamp oil and the clay tablets and the temple processions and the deportee workers pulling stone across the palace courtyard, is to see a city that was genuinely, humanly complex in a way that simple condemnation and simple idealization both miss. It was a city where 150,000 people woke up every morning and tried to live, under conditions that ranged from palace luxury to bound labor and everything in between. It was a city that produced one of the world's first great libraries and used that library's administrative texts to organize the systematic displacement of 100 peoples. It was a city whose walls were once the most impressive human construction on Earth, and whose name, within 2 centuries of its destruction, had been entirely erased from the memory of people walking past its ruins. What does it mean to understand a place like that? What does it mean to read the ancient texts that spoke its name? Those are questions that the dust of Nineveh has been waiting a long time for someone to ask.